Every king fears the assassin's dagger. King Valerius feared a ghost. Tonight, you will learn that the greatest treason in the kingdom of Eldoria was not a secret affair with a living soul, but a dark obsession with a love that had died 5 years ago. But how do you fight a rival you cannot see? How do you win a heart that already belongs to the dead? To the world, Queen Isolde was the perfect monarch. She was beautiful, intelligent, and had given the king a healthy male heir. Their marriage was the bedrock of a peaceful and prosperous kingdom. But in the cold intimacy of the royal chambers, Isolde knew she was merely a placeholder, a regent for a memory. She was the second wife, and she lived in the long, suffocating shadow of the first. Queen Liana, who had died in childbirth, was not a woman. She was a saint, a martyr. Her portraits, with their serene, knowing smiles, hung in every hall. The king spoke her name like a prayer and demanded his court do the same. In recent months, however, his grief had curdled into something far more sinister. He neglected his counsel, his eyes distant and haunted. He spent his nights locked away in the sealed West Tower, the very place Liana had lived and died, a place he had forbidden anyone from entering. The court whispered that the king's heart was broken. Isolde suspected it was not broken, but poisoned. Driven by a cold dread, she decided to uncover the truth. One moonless night, she followed him. He slipped from their chambers like a phantom, his destination the forbidden tower. While the main door was barred with heavy iron, Isolde knew of an old servant's passage, its entrance hidden behind a loose tapestry depicting a forgotten battle. She slipped inside, the air thick with dust and the scent of decay. She followed the sound of his ragged whispers up the winding staircase, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The whispers led her to Liana's old bedchamber, a room preserved perfectly, as if its occupant had only just stepped out. Through the heavy oak door's keyhole, she saw the horrifying truth of the king's dark desire. Valerius was not alone. The room was filled with arcane instruments, bubbling vials, and strange, esoteric charts mapping the stars. He stood before a vast, silvered mirror, his hands pressed against the cold glass, pleading. And for a sickening, impossible moment, Isolde saw it too. A shimmering, ethereal shape within the mirror, the ghostly image of the dead queen, her form translucent and sad. He wasn't mourning his dead wife. He was trying to bring her back. The king's secret wasn't a woman of flesh and blood. It was an echo in a cursed mirror. This obsession will unravel a kingdom, and I want to know how far its dark ripples will spread. Comment below from what city or country you are hearing this forbidden tale, and subscribe, because the whispers from the other side are only getting louder. Isolde stumbled back from the keyhole, a cold that had nothing to do with the tower's chill seeping into her bones. This was not the familiar human pain of infidelity. This was a far deeper horror. It was the sight of a king communing with madness, attempting to shatter the very laws of life and death. The jealousy she might have felt for a living rival was replaced by a profound, terrifying pity, and an even more profound sense of duty. The man she had married was not just unfaithful, he was becoming undone. Her husband was a matter of the heart, but the king was a matter of the realm, and the king was dangerously unwell. She did not confront him. How could she? Accusing a man of necromancy was a charge as insane as the act itself. Instead, she retreated to the one place in the castle that held more secrets than any courtier, the royal archives. Under the guise of researching her own lineage, she spent days poring over ancient forbidden texts, their pages brittle and smelling of dust and ozone. She read of shadow weavers and spirit callers, of rituals that promised to bridge the gap between worlds. The warnings in these tomes were stark and written in the dried blood of forgotten scribes. Such magic, they claimed, did not create life. It only stole it. To give a spirit form, even a spectral one, required a tremendous amount of energy, a life force that had to be drawn from the living. The rituals spoke of a terrible price, a slow, draining sickness that would affect the land, the animals, and the people closest to the source of the summoning. It was a creeping plague of the soul, and Isolde realized with dawning horror that the symptoms were already beginning to manifest. The king's decay was no longer just spiritual, it was political. In the Privy Council he had become erratic and dangerously impulsive. He dismissed a border dispute with the volatile southern clans with a wave of his hand, only to fly into a rage over the procurement of new tapestries for the Great Hall. He stared at empty chairs, as if listening to a conversation no one else could hear. The lords of his council exchanged worried glances, their faith in their monarch eroding with each passing day. It was Lord Commander Borin, the grizzled, pragmatic leader of the king's armies, who finally broke the silent fear. He sought out the queen in the gardens, his face etched with concern. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice a low rumble, "forgive my forwardness, but the king's command is becoming unsound." He ordered a full legion to march to the coast on a rumor of foreign ships, a rumor that was proven false. The men grow weary of these whims. The realm requires a steady hand on the tiller, now more than ever. He did not say the word treason, but his meaning was clear. He was a man of logic and order, and he saw a tide of chaos rising from the throne itself. His loyalty was shifting from the man to the crown, and he was now looking at her to protect it. The sickness described in the ancient texts began to bleed into the very stones of the castle. A strange, unnatural coldness clung to the corridors of the West Wing, a chill that no fire could warm. Servants fell ill with a strange lethargy, their bodies healthy, but their spirits drained. A prized falcon in the royal mews was found dead, with no signs of injury. The castle itself seemed to groan under a heavy, invisible weight. Isolde knew, with a certainty that terrified her, that the king's dark desire was literally draining the life from his kingdom to feed the ghost of his dead wife. She could remain silent no longer. She confronted him in his study, her evidence not a keyhole, but the state of his realm. "The court is sick, Valerius," she said, her voice steely. "The castle is dying. Whatever profane ritual you are conducting in that tower, it is the source of this decay. You are sacrificing your kingdom for a ghost." The king, who had been staring at a portrait of Liana, turned to her, and for the first time she saw no grief in his eyes, only the wild, zealous fire of a fanatic. "You call it decay, I call it a transformation," he snarled, his voice a stranger's. "You speak of a kingdom of stone and men. I am building a bridge to a kingdom of eternity. A love like ours cannot be bound by death, and I will pay any price to see her again." His confession was absolute. He knew the cost, and he was willing to let his entire world wither and die to reclaim a woman who was already gone. The king's fanatical confession had changed the rules of the game. Isolde was no longer dealing with a grieving husband, but with a zealot who had declared war on the natural order. Reason had failed. A plea for his kingdom had failed. She knew then that she could not save the man, but she had to save the throne. She retreated once more to the archives, this time with a singular, desperate purpose. She was no longer looking for a diagnosis. She was searching for a weapon. With the help of the terrified but loyal old Maester Elian, she delved deeper into the forbidden lore. They found what they were looking for, not in the grand histories, but in the footnotes of a disgraced scholar's journal. The text spoke of necromantic summonings. It described how a powerful, lingering emotion, like a king's obsessive grief, could be used as a tether, an anchor to hold a spirit in the mortal plane. But the tether was not just emotional, it was physical. The spirit had to be bound to a focal point, an object of immense personal significance, and a conduit, a gateway between the worlds. To break the spell, she had to destroy the anchors. Isolde knew she could not act alone. She needed steel, not just scholarship. She summoned Lord Commander Borin to a secret meeting in the heart of the Royal Armoury, surrounded by the cold, practical instruments of war. There she laid the full, insane truth before him, the ghost, the life-draining magic, the king's descent into heresy. Borin, a man who had faced down charging cavalry and enemy sorcerers, listened with a grim, unwavering focus. He did not dismiss her words as madness. He had seen the proof in the king's erratic commands and in the faces of his own ailing soldiers. Magic, or madness, it is a rot that is killing this kingdom from the head down, Borin growled, his hand resting on the pommel of his great sword. I swore an oath to protect this realm, Your Majesty. That oath is to the crown, not to the man who is currently trying to burn it to the ground. What are your orders? The words were a declaration of allegiance. In that moment, the balance of power in the kingdom quietly shifted. Their plan was desperate, a sacrilegious gambit that could see them both executed. The anchors, Isolde explained, were twofold. Lyanna's tomb in the royal crypt, her physical resting place, and the great silvered mirror in the West Tower, the conduit for the ritual, both had to be cleansed. Borin agreed. He would stage a near riot in the Lower Bailey, a supposed pay dispute with a mercenary company that would draw the bulk of the palace guard, including the king's personal retinue, away from the royal chambers. This would give Isolde a small window to act. That night, as shouts and the clash of steel echoed from the far side of the castle, Isolde, cloaked in black, slipped into the deathly cold of the West Tower. She carried not a scepter but a heavy iron war maul taken from the armory, its weight both a burden and a comfort. She reached the chamber. The air was frigid, and the strange alchemical instruments bubbled silently in the gloom. The great mirror dominated the room, its surface shimmering with a faint, sickly luminescence. As she stepped into the chamber, the shimmering intensified, and the form of Queen Lyanna appeared within the glass. She was beautiful, sad, and ethereal. But as Isolde stepped closer, the illusion wavered. The serene face of the dead queen flickered, and for a terrifying second, Isolde saw something else beneath it, a face that was ancient, predatory, and filled with a bottomless hunger. The beautiful ghost smiled, but the voice that echoed in Isolde's mind was not Lyanna's. It was a dry, rasping chorus of whispers. "The king is a fine vessel," it hissed, the words slithering into her thoughts. His grief made him a perfect key. He seeks to bring his love back, but it is I who will be reborn from his sorrow. The truth was a physical blow. This was not the ghost of Queen Lyanna. This was a parasite, a nameless ancient thing from the void that had been drawn to the king's immense grief and was now wearing his dead wife's memory like a mask, feeding on his love and the life of his kingdom. "Join me," the entity offered, its voice dripping with seductive power. "Help me break free of this silver prison, and you will share in a power you cannot imagine." The king was not a fanatic. He was a puppet. Isolde was not fighting a memory. She was fighting a demon. She hefted the war maul, its weight now feeling entirely inadequate. Her plan had been to break a spell. Now she had to kill a god. Isolde stood before the shimmering glass, the heavy war maul in her hands, feeling like a child's toy. The entity wearing Lyanna's face spoke, its voice a seductive poison poured directly into her mind. It did not threaten, it offered. It showed her visions of power, of a kingdom where she would rule not as a second choice, but as an eternal worshipped goddess. It showed her a vision of King Valerius, his eyes finally cleared of his grief, looking at her with the same obsessive love he had held for the dead. "He can be yours, truly and completely," the entity whispered. "His heart, his soul, his every breath. All I ask is that you open the door, shatter the glass, set me free." It was a masterful temptation, preying on every insecurity, every lonely night she had ever endured. But the entity, for all its ancient power, had made a critical miscalculation. It assumed it was speaking to a scorned wife. It did not realize it was facing a queen. "You offer me a gilded cage, just like the one I already live in." Isolde's voice was steady, cutting through the psychic whispers. "You speak of love, but you are a parasite that feasts on sorrow. You wear a dead woman's face because you have no identity of your own." She took a step closer, her knuckles white on the handle of the maul. "You are not a god, you are a prisoner, and I am your warden." Udu, the liana facade contorted in a flash of rage, the beautiful face melting away to reveal a swirling vortex of shadow and countless screaming mouths. A wave of pure terror and icy despair washed out from the mirror, a psychic force designed to paralyze her heart with fear. It slammed into her, and for a moment her breath caught, her knees buckled. But she held on, anchoring herself to the one pure thing she had left, her duty to protect the innocent people being drained by this creature's hunger. With a defiant roar that was half prayer, half curse, she swung the heavy iron maul with all her might. The maul struck the mirror with a sound that was not like breaking glass, but like the snapping of a bone. A soul-tearing shriek erupted from the mirror, a sound that echoed not in the air, but in the minds of everyone in the castle, causing servants to cry out and guards to stumble. A web of black, smoking cracks spread across the silvered surface. The monstrous form within recoiled, weakened and wounded, but the mirror did not shatter. It held. And in that moment, Isolde understood the horrifying truth. The mirror was not just a portal, it was a prison. A cage forged by ancient magic to contain this very entity. The king's foolish ritual had not summoned it, it had merely woken it up. Shattering the mirror would not banish the creature. It would unleash it upon the world. Her simple plan of destruction was a fool's errand that would have doomed them all. The sounds of Borin's staged riot were dying down. Time was running out. Isolde fled the tower, leaving the cracked, shrieking mirror behind her. She ran to the archives, to the one man she knew could help her navigate this new, terrifying landscape. She explained everything to Meister Elion, whose face grew paler with every word. Together, they searched with frantic desperation, not for lore on summoning, but for texts on banishment and exorcism. They found it in a scorched manuscript that spoke of the ritual of severance. The text was clear. To defeat a parasitic entity, the link to its host had to be permanently destroyed. The king, whose life force and grief were the monster's food, was the host. The ritual demanded a sacrifice of royal blood, willingly given to sever the magical tether. His death was the only way to starve the beast, but it also required a second person, a vessel of pure intent, someone of royal blood who could channel the banishing rite, forcing the weakened entity back into its prison before the final seal could be placed upon it. A role so dangerous, the text warned, that it could shatter the vessel's mind or soul. Isolde looked at the Meister, her course clear. She finally had a true plan. To save her kingdom, the queen would have to become a sorceress. To save the world from the monster in the mirror, she would have to perform a dark ritual. And to save his soul, she would have to kill her own king. The die was cast. There was no turning back. The hours leading up to the ritual were a blur of tense, whispered preparations. In the cavernous, torchlit library, Meister Elion, his hands trembling with a mixture of fear and grim purpose, gathered the esoteric components described in the scorched manuscript. Vials of pure seawater, dust ground from meteoric iron, and oils of frankincense and myrrh, substances meant for purification and sealing. He worked in silence, the weight of the heresy he was about to aid pressing down on him. Meanwhile, Lord Commander Borin moved with the brutal efficiency of a lifelong soldier. He gathered the 10 men of his personal guard, veterans whose loyalty to him was absolute and whose nerves were forged in the crucible of a dozen campaigns. He did not tell them of ghosts or demons. He spoke in a language they understood. "The king is under a sorcerous affliction," he told them, his voice a low growl. "A curse that is poisoning the castle. The queen has found a way to break it, but the ritual is delicate and dangerous. Our task is to secure the West Tower. No one enters. No one leaves. We are the wall that will protect her, no matter what sounds you hear from within. You will hold the line, or die where you stand." They nodded, their faces grim. They were not fighting for a king or a queen. They were fighting for their realm. Isolde's preparation was internal. She was preparing herself to kill her husband. She went to her son's nursery, watching the young prince sleep peacefully in his cot, his face untroubled. She felt a surge of love so fierce it was a physical pain. This was the reason. Not for a crown, not for power, but for his future. For a world not ruled by a madman and his demonic parasite. She was a mother protecting her child, and a queen protecting her people. The two duties had merged into one terrible, necessary act. This clarity gave her the strength for the most difficult part of her plan, the final deception. She went to Valerius. She found him in his study, staring at Lyanna's portrait, lost in his obsession. She fell to her knees before him, her performance one of absolute broken submission. Tears streamed down her face. "You were right," she wept, her voice choked with fabricated despair. "I was a fool to fight it. The love you share is stronger than this world. I want to help you." The king, blinded by his fanaticism, saw only what he wanted to see, the final surrender of his defiant wife. "I have been reading," she continued. "I found another text. It describes the final step, a way to give her form, to make her real. It requires an amplification, a sacrifice of will from another of royal blood. I will be your anchor. I will help you bring her back." The king was ecstatic, his eyes alight with a manic, triumphant glee. He pulled her to her feet, his grip like iron. "I knew you would see," he whispered, his breath hot and feverish. "I knew you would finally understand." He agreed instantly to meet her in the tower at moonrise, to perform the ritual that would be his salvation and her final, terrible betrayal. That night, the West Tower was a vortex of unnatural cold. The cracked mirror pulsed with a hungry, malevolent rhythm. Valerius stood before it, his face rapturous, watching the shimmering form of Lyanna grow stronger. Isolde began the ritual. She drew a great circle on the floor with the salt and iron dust, not just around the mirror, but encompassing the very spot where the king stood. She chanted the ancient words, her voice clear and steady, a thread of order in a storm of chaos. The entity in the mirror sensed the true nature of the ritual and began to whisper, not to Isolde, but to the king. "She is tricking you. Stop her." Valerius, lost in his delirium, only heard it as a sign that the connection was strengthening. "Yes, it's working," he cried, turning to Isolde with a joyful, insane smile. "More power." That was her cue. The performance was over. Isolde met his gaze, and all the feigned submission, all the false tears vanished, replaced by the cold, sorrowful authority of a queen passing sentence. "This ritual is not to bring her back, Valerius," she said, her voice echoing with newfound power. "It is to cast that thing into the hell it came from." The king stared, his joy turning to horrified disbelief. You lied to me," he stammered. "You would betray our love." His voice was now a duet with the shrieking whispers from the mirror. He lunged for her, a king betrayed, but it was too late. As he took his first step, the circle on the floor erupted in a column of blinding silver light. He had walked directly into the sacrificial trap. The final rupture was not between a queen and a demon, but between a husband and the wife who now had to destroy him to save his soul. The instant the circle of light flared to life, the entity in the mirror knew it had been deceived. The mask of Queen Lyanna dissolved, not into shadow, but into a tapestry of pure rage. A psychic scream of impossible fury erupted from the glass. a soundless wave of power that shattered every vial in the chamber and extinguished the torches, plunging the room into a terrifying darkness, lit only by the glowing prison on the floor and the cracked, malevolent mirror. The war for the soul of the kingdom had begun. The entity could not physically leave its prison, but its mind was a weapon. It threw everything it had at Isolde. The air grew thick with horrifying illusions, phantoms born from her deepest fears. She saw visions of her son, his face pale and sick, calling for her. She saw Lord Commander Borin and his men being overwhelmed by a tide of shadow creatures. She saw herself, old and alone, dying forgotten in a cold, empty castle. Every image was a poisoned dart aimed at her concentration, designed to find a single crack of fear in her resolve, the one crack the entity needed to shatter her mind and break the ritual. Isolde stood at the heart of the storm, chanting the ancient words of banishment, her voice the only anchor in a sea of madness. The strain was immense. She felt the entity clawing at the edges of her sanity, whispering promises and threats, digging for purchase in her soul. Blood began to trickle from her nose, a physical manifestation of the psychic war she was waging. But she held on. She anchored herself not to hope, but to a cold, unyielding duty. She thought of her son's sleeping face, of Borin's unwavering loyalty, of the thousands of innocent people in the kingdom whose life force was being leached away. She was not just a woman. She was a shield, and she would not break. Outside, the supernatural battle bled into the physical world. The sky above the West Tower twisted into a vortex of bruised, unnatural clouds. A gale of freezing wind howled through the courtyard, ripping banners from the walls and sending men stumbling. The psychic shriek from the tower washed over the soldiers, and several of the younger guards dropped to their knees, screaming and clutching their heads. From the mortar between the ancient stones of the tower, a thick black ichor began to ooze, as if the castle itself were bleeding. In the midst of the chaos, Lord Commander Borin was a mountain of iron. "Hold the line," he roared, his voice a thunderclap that cut through the unholy wind. "Whatever demon is in that tower, it answers to our queen tonight. You will not falter, for Eldoria." His men, their fear momentarily burned away by the heat of his command, reformed their shield wall, a tiny bastion of order against a storm of cosmic rage. Back in the chamber, the ritual was reaching its apex. King Valerius, trapped within the circle, was being consumed. The silver light was burning away the entity's influence, and with it, his life force. He was no longer the raging fanatic. The creature's weakening grip on his mind allowed a final, horrifying moment of lucidity. The fog of his grief and obsession cleared, and he saw the truth. He saw the monster in the mirror for what it was. He saw the oozing walls of his castle. And he saw Isolde, bleeding, exhausted, fighting a war for his very soul. He understood the terrible price of his obsession. With the last of his strength, he looked at his wife, his eyes finally his own. "Isolde," he rasped, his voice a faint echo of the man he once was. "Forgive me. For our son, end it." He closed his eyes and willingly gave the last of his life to the ritual. His sacrifice was the final, devastating key. The silver circle exploded into a silent, blinding flash of pure golden light, the amplified power of the banishing rite striking the entity with the force of a falling star. The monster let out one last, silent scream of utter defeat as it was slammed back into the deepest, darkest corners of its prison, and the chamber fell into a sudden, profound silence. The golden light faded, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt like the world had ended. The unnatural cold in the chamber was gone, replaced by the simple stillness of a room where a great struggle had just ceased. The mirror, once a swirling vortex of malice, was now just a dark, inert piece of glass, its cracked surface reflecting the scene with dull indifference. King Valerius lay in the center of the now faded circle, the manic torment gone from his face, leaving only a tragic, peaceful emptiness. He was, at last, free. Isolde fell to her knees, the strength that had poured through her during the ritual vanishing in an instant, leaving her bone deeply weary, a warrior whose war was finally over. The heavy oak door creaked open, and Lord Commander Borin entered, his sword drawn, his face a grim mask of concern. He saw his dead king, the strange markings on the floor, and his queen, alive but utterly spent. In that moment, he understood not what had happened, but that it was over. He drove the tip of his sword into the stone floor and knelt before her. "Your Majesty," he said, his gruff voice thick with an unfamiliar emotion. "The line was held. What are your commands?" His words were not a question. They were an oath of fealty to the new, undisputed power in the realm. The story told to the royal council the next day was a carefully constructed masterpiece of political necessity. Isolde, standing before them cloaked in black, her face pale, but her voice unwavering, did not speak of demons or parasitic entities. She spoke of a truth the court could understand: treason. She told them the king, in his profound and understandable grief, had fallen under the sway of a heretical cult of mystics who had promised him a way to speak with the dead. These traitors, she explained, had poisoned his mind, feeding his sorrow and manipulating him for their own dark purposes. She painted Valerius not as a madman, but as a tragic victim who, in his final moments of clarity, realized he had been deceived and had heroically sacrificed his own life to break their hold and expose their heresy. It was a noble lie, a narrative that preserved the honor of the crown, gave the kingdom a tangible enemy to blame, and explained the strange sickness that had plagued the castle. She then sealed the story in blood. Borin, acting on her authority as Queen Regent, arrested the few remaining occultists who had aided the king. Their swift public execution served as a brutal and effective final chapter to the official tale. Isolde had not only won the supernatural war, she had masterfully won the political one, seizing control of the story that history would tell. Weeks later, a fragile peace had settled over the kingdom. The unnatural sickness had lifted, and the court was slowly rebuilding under its new, decisive ruler. Isolde stood in the courtyard, watching as stonemasons sealed the entrance to the West Tower, entombing the dark mirror and its prisoner in a wall of solid rock, never to be disturbed again. She had saved them all, she had protected her son's future and secured the throne. But as she turned away from the sealed tower for the last time, there was no triumph in her heart. She was a queen forged in a crucible of madness and sorrow, a victor who had been forced to sacrifice her own husband to win the peace. She walked back towards the light of the main keep, her shadow long behind her. The war was over, but the weight of the crown and the memory of its terrible price was a burden she would now carry alone for the rest of her days. She paid a terrible price for the truth, but some truths are worth any cost. Her vengeance wasn't about blood. It was about rewriting her own story. What is a truth you would fight for? Let me know in the comments. And if you believe the most powerful stories belong to those who refuse to be silenced, subscribe to the channel.